King Edward Alexander stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the autumn rain streak down the ancient glass. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did today. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the confidential report that would change everything. The Palace of Windermere had seen many crises over its 800-year history, but nothing quite like this. The knock on his door came precisely at 4 o'clock, just as he had requested. Queen Isabella entered with her usual grace, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the storm raging outside. She had been his anchor for 30 years of marriage through scandals, political upheavals, and personal tragedies. Today he needed her strength more than ever. "You look troubled, my dear," Isabella said softly, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Her keen blue eyes studied his face with the intuition that only decades of partnership could provide. "The Prime Minister's visit this morning didn't go well, did it?" Edward closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of his 68 years. The report lay between them like a loaded weapon. Inside those manila pages was evidence that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. His youngest son, Prince Christopher, had been secretly involved in financial dealings that bordered on treason. Worse still, the investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. "Isabella," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid we're facing the greatest threat to our reign since the Revolution of 1789. Perhaps even greater." He pushed the report across the polished mahogany desk. "Christopher has made choices that could destroy us all." The Queen's composure never wavered as she opened the file, but Edward watched the color drain from her cheeks as she read. Page after page revealed how their son had accepted millions from foreign agents, how he had used his royal status to influence military contracts, and how he had betrayed state secrets for personal gain. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "How long have you known?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the devastation in her eyes. 3 days, Edward replied. "The intelligence services brought it to me directly. They've been investigating for months." "Isabella, if this becomes public..." He couldn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it would mean. The end of the monarchy. The destruction of a 1,000-year dynasty. Christopher would face charges of high treason, and the scandal would consume them all. Isabella set down the report and moved to the window where her husband stood. The rain had intensified, turning the palace gardens into a gray blur. "What are our options?" she asked, though they both knew the choices were limited and painful. "The Prime Minister has given us 72 hours, Edward said. "Either we strip Christopher of all titles and hand him over for prosecution, or Parliament will call for a vote of no confidence in the Crown. The evidence will become public either way, but our response will determine whether the monarchy survives." The silence stretched between them as the weight of the decision settled in. Christopher was their youngest child, born late in their marriage when they had thought their family was complete. He had always been different from his older siblings, charming but reckless, intelligent but lacking judgment. They had covered for his smaller scandals over the years, hoping he would mature. This time there was no covering up. "There's something else," Edward continued, his voice breaking slightly. "The investigation has also uncovered evidence that Christopher wasn't acting alone. Several members of the Royal Council were involved. People we've trusted for decades have betrayed us. The corruption goes deeper than we ever imagined." Isabella reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Then we face it together, as we always have. Our duty is to the Crown first, to the people second, and to our family last. It's the oath we took when we married." Edward nodded, remembering that day 30 years ago when they had pledged to put the monarchy above all else. Neither of them had imagined it would one day mean sacrificing their own child. "The public announcement will have to be carefully crafted. We need to show that justice will be served while maintaining faith in the institution." "What about Catherine and James?" Isabella asked, referring to their older children. "They need to be prepared. This will affect their futures as well." "I've called a family meeting for tomorrow morning," Edward replied. "They deserve to hear this from us before it becomes public knowledge. Catherine, as heir apparent, will need to address the nation alongside us. She'll bear the burden of rebuilding public trust." As the afternoon faded into evening, the royal couple stood together in contemplative silence. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Edward couldn't help but see it as an omen. The tempest battering the palace walls was nothing compared to the storm that would soon engulf their family and their kingdom. "Do you think we'll survive this?" Isabella asked, voicing the fear they both carried. Edward squeezed her hand tighter. "We've weathered worse storms, my love. But this time I fear the very foundations of everything we've built may crumble. The people trusted us to be above reproach, and we failed them. The weight of tomorrow's decisions pressed down on them both. In less than 24 hours they would have to stand before their children and explain how their youngest son had betrayed everything the crown represented. And in 72 hours they would face the nation with news that would change the monarchy forever." The morning sun cast long shadows across the gold drawing room as the royal family gathered for what would become known as the most devastating meeting in palace history. Princess Catherine arrived first, her usual confident demeanor masking the concern she felt about the urgent summons. At 35, she had been groomed for leadership her entire life, but nothing had prepared her for what was coming. Prince James followed shortly after, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. At 32, he had served with distinction in the Royal Navy and now managed several charitable foundations. The middle child had always been the steadiest of the three siblings, the one who avoided controversy and fulfilled his duties without complaint. Christopher was the last to arrive, and the tension in the room became palpable the moment he entered. At 28, he possessed the same striking features as his siblings, but there was something different about him today. His usual carefree smile was strained, and dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. He avoided direct eye contact with his parents as he took his seat. King Edward stood at the head of the ornate table, the same table where treaties had been signed and state decisions made for generations. Queen Isabella sat to his right, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her knuckles were white with tension. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Edward finally spoke. "I've called you here because our family faces the gravest crisis in living memory," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything we know about our future and our legacy." Catherine leaned forward slightly, her political instincts alert. "Father, what's happened?" "The Prime Minister's emergency visit yesterday, the cancelled engagements. The palace staff are talking." Edward's gaze fell on Christopher, who had grown noticeably pale. "Your brother has made choices that threaten the very existence of the monarchy." "Christopher, I think you know why we're here." The young prince's composure cracked instantly. His hands began to shake as he looked around the table at his family's faces. "I can explain everything," he said, his voice barely audible. "It started small, just a few favors for friends. I never meant for it to go this far." James straightened in his chair, his military training kicking in. "Christopher, what exactly are we talking about here?" Queen Isabella slid the investigation report across the table to her older children. "Read it," she said simply. "All of it." The next 20 minutes passed in horrifying silence as Catherine and James absorbed the full scope of their brother's betrayal. Catherine's diplomatic training helped her maintain composure, but James couldn't hide his shock. His face flushed red with anger as he read about classified military information being sold to foreign agents. £30 million, Catherine said finally, her voice cold. "You accepted £30 million from enemy states while wearing the uniform of this nation's navy. How could you do this to us? To the people who believe in what we represent." Christopher's tears came then, years of guilt and fear finally breaking through. "I was drowning in debt. The gambling, the investments that went wrong, I couldn't ask Father for help again. Marcus Thornfield approached me at a charity gala. He said it was just business intelligence, nothing that would hurt anyone." "Marcus Thornfield?" James demanded. "The arms dealer?" "Christopher, he's been under investigation for war crimes. How could you be so naive?" "It wasn't supposed to be about weapons," Christopher protested. "He said he just needed to know about trade negotiations, economic policies. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was in too deep. They had evidence of everything I'd done. They owned me." King Edward sat down heavily, looking older than his years. "The intelligence services have been tracking this network for 18 months. They have recordings of your meetings, financial records, copies of the documents you provided. There's no denying any of it." Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the window, her mind racing through the political implications. "How long before this becomes public knowledge?" "What's our timeline?" 72 hours, Edward replied. The Prime Minister has given us that long to decide how to handle it internally before Parliament takes action. And our options? James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. We strip Christopher of all titles and hand him over for prosecution, Isabella said quietly, or we face a vote of no confidence that could end the monarchy entirely. The room fell silent again as the weight of the decision settled on them. Christopher looked up at his siblings through his tears. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please don't let my mistakes destroy everything our family has built. I'll accept whatever punishment comes, but the crown has to survive. Catherine turned from the window, her expression hardening into the mask she wore during difficult diplomatic negotiations. The crown will survive, but not because of your newfound conscience. It will survive because the rest of us will work to rebuild what you've destroyed. There's more, Edward said grimly. The investigation revealed that several members of the Royal Council were involved. Lord Pemberton, Sir Richard Ashworth, and at least 3 others accepted payments from the same network. The corruption reaches into the highest levels of our administration. James pounded his fist on the table. 40 years of service between them. 40 years of our trust, and they sold us out for money. Which means we can't trust anyone in our inner circle, Catherine added. We'll need to assume that everything we've discussed in council meetings for the past 2 years may have been compromised. Christopher raised his head slowly. There are others who weren't part of the financial scheme but who knew what was happening. They're terrified their careers will be over if the truth comes out. Some of them have families, children in private schools, mortgages on country houses. The network Thornfield built goes beyond just taking money. Are you suggesting we protect people who covered up treason? James asked incredulously. I'm saying the damage is wider than you know, Christopher replied. Half the government is compromised in some way. If everyone involved faces prosecution, the entire system could collapse. Queen Isabella spoke for the first time in several minutes. Then we must be very careful about how we proceed. We cannot allow justice to be sacrificed, but we also cannot allow chaos to consume the nation. Catherine returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. We need a strategy that serves justice while preserving stability. Some kind of truth and reconciliation process, perhaps. Full disclosure with graduated consequences based on the level of involvement. The media will crucify us, James pointed out. Every newspaper, every television station will have experts analyzing every decision we make. The opposition parties will call for abolition of the monarchy, Edward nodded gravely. Which is why our response must be perfect. One mistake, one sign of weakness or favoritism, and we lose everything our ancestors built over 1,000 years. Christopher looked around the table at his family, seeing the disappointment and determination in their faces. What can I do to help? I know I've lost the right to be part of this family's future, but maybe I can still help protect it. The question hung in the air as the royal family contemplated the most difficult decision any of them had ever faced. The secure conference room deep within the palace had been swept for listening devices 3 times in the past hour. Around the polished oak table sat the reduced inner circle of advisors that King Edward still trusted. General Harrison from Military Intelligence, Sir Margaret Whitfield from the Diplomatic Corps, and David Coleman, the palace's crisis management specialist who had been summoned from his vacation in Scotland. Queen Isabella entered with a tea service, a deliberate choice to maintain some semblance of normalcy in this most abnormal situation. Princess Catherine followed close behind, carrying a stack of international law books and diplomatic precedents. They had spent the night researching how other monarchies had survived similar crises. Before we begin, Edward announced, I want everyone to understand that what we discuss here may determine whether the crown survives the next 72 hours. Everything we say is protected by state security protocols. General Harrison opened a leather portfolio filled with classified briefings. Your Majesty, I've been in contact with our allies' intelligence services. The network Prince Christopher was involved with has tentacles reaching into at least 6 other European nations. The Americans have been tracking related activities for 2 years. What does that mean for us? Catherine asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. It means this isn't just a domestic scandal, Sir Margaret replied. If we handle this correctly, we can position ourselves as victims of an international conspiracy, rather than complicit parties. The narrative matters enormously. David Coleman spread out several mock newspaper headlines across the table. These are the stories we're likely to see depending on how we frame our response. Royal family betrayed by terrorist network versus corrupt prince brings down monarchy. The difference is everything. Isabella studied the headlines with growing concern. What about Christopher? He's still our son, regardless of what he's done. We can't simply throw him to the wolves. Ma'am, with respect, Prince Christopher threw himself to the wolves. General Harrison said bluntly. Our job now is to minimize the damage to the institution and the nation. Edward rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. What are the Americans offering? Cooperation, Harrison replied. They want Thornfield and his network more than they want Christopher. If we can deliver intelligence that helps them dismantle the entire operation, they're willing to support our version of events publicly. Catherine looked up from her notes. That could work in our favor internationally, but domestic opinion is what matters for survival. What does the latest polling show? Coleman consulted his tablet. Support for the monarchy sits at 68% currently, but that's before any of this becomes public. Historical analysis suggests it could drop to the low 30s if we appear to be covering up criminal activity, and if we're seen as taking decisive action against corruption. Isabella asked. It could actually increase support, Coleman admitted. The public respects accountability from leadership. If we're seen as putting justice above family loyalty, it could strengthen the institution long term. A knock interrupted their discussion. Catherine's private secretary entered with an urgent message. Your Royal Highness, the BBC is asking for comment on rumors about Prince Christopher. They claim to have sources confirming an investigation. The room fell silent. Their 72-hour window was shrinking rapidly. Sir Margaret leaned forward. We need to get ahead of this story. If the media breaks it before we can frame our response, we lose control of the narrative entirely. How much do they know? Edward asked. Catherine's secretary consulted her notes. They're being vague, but they mentioned financial irregularities and foreign connections. It sounds like they have pieces, but not the full picture yet. Coleman stood up and began pacing. This changes everything. We need to make our announcement within the next 12 hours before speculation becomes accepted fact. Are we ready? Isabella asked. We haven't even decided exactly what we're going to say. General Harrison pulled out another file. I have a proposal that might address everyone's concerns. We announced that the royal family has been cooperating with international intelligence agencies to expose a foreign conspiracy targeting British institutions. We frame Christopher as someone who was initially deceived but who then helped expose the network. Catherine shook her head. That's not honest. Christopher wasn't trying to help expose anything until he got caught. But he is helping now, Harrison pointed out. He's agreed to full cooperation. We can truthfully say that a member of the royal family assisted in uncovering an international crime network. Edward considered this carefully. What about the financial aspects? He still took money. We acknowledge that he was financially compromised by the network, Sir Margaret suggested. We can frame it as sophisticated psychological manipulation by trained intelligence operatives. It's not entirely false. These networks do target vulnerable individuals. Isabella stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. In the distance, she could see tourists gathering for the changing of the guard, oblivious to the crisis unfolding inside these walls. What happens to Christopher in this scenario? He faces justice, Coleman said simply, but as a victim who became a whistleblower rather than a simple traitor. The legal consequences might be reduced, but there will still be consequences. Catherine had been quietly calculating political ramifications. If we go with this approach, I need to address Parliament immediately after the public announcement. The Prime Minister will face questions, and we need to ensure our stories align perfectly. There's another complication, Harrison said reluctantly. 3 of the compromised council members are threatening to go public with their own versions of events if they're prosecuted. They claim they have information that could damage the royal family beyond repair. Edward's face darkened. What kind of information? They won't say specifically, but Lord Pemberton hints at financial irregularities in several royal charities from years past. Things that were handled quietly at the time but could look suspicious under scrutiny. The weight of decades of small compromises and quiet solutions suddenly felt crushing. Every favor called in, every problem quietly resolved. Every time they had chosen discretion over transparency. All of it could now be weaponized against them. Isabella returned to the table with renewed determination. Then we face it all. Whatever they have, whatever emerges, we meet it with complete honesty from this point forward. No more secrets, no more quiet solutions. The crown survives on trust, and trust requires truth. Catherine nodded in agreement. Mother's right. We can't build a defense on partial truths and hope nothing else emerges. We need to prepare for full disclosure. Coleman looked alarmed. Your Royal Highness, that's extremely risky. If there are other issues that haven't been properly documented or explained, then we document and explain them now, Edward said firmly. Margaret, I want a complete audit of every potential vulnerability. David, prepare statements addressing anything that might emerge. We're going to control this story by telling all of it ourselves. General Harrison closed his portfolio. That's either the bravest or most foolish strategy I've ever heard from this office. Perhaps both, Isabella admitted. But it's the only strategy that allows us to sleep at night knowing we've done the right thing. As the afternoon wore on, the team worked frantically to prepare for what would either be the salvation or destruction of the British monarchy. Outside, storm clouds gathered again, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the palace windows. The throne room had been transformed into a television studio, with cameras positioned to capture both the grandeur of the monarchy and the gravity of the moment. King Edward stood behind the same podium where monarchs had addressed the nation during wars, disasters, and moments of great celebration. Today would be remembered as something entirely different. Queen Isabella sat in the front row alongside Princess Catherine, both wearing somber navy blue, a careful choice that conveyed seriousness without appearing funereal. Prince James stood at attention in his naval uniform, while Christopher was notably absent, following the agreed strategy to keep him out of the initial announcement. At precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, the red recording light illuminated. Edward looked directly into the camera, his expression carrying the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy and the uncertainty of its future. My fellow citizens, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I address you tonight on a matter of the utmost gravity that affects not only the royal family, but the security and integrity of our nation. In living rooms across the kingdom, families stopped their evening routines to listen. In pubs and restaurants, conversations ceased as the gravity in the king's voice became apparent. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation even before he spoke his next words. Over the past 18 months, our intelligence services have been investigating an international criminal network that has attempted to infiltrate the highest levels of British society. This investigation has revealed that several individuals close to the crown, including my youngest son, Prince Christopher, were targeted and compromised by this organization. The first gasps echoed through the throne room from the assembled palace staff and officials. Catherine watched her father carefully, knowing how much this admission was costing him. Personally, Prince Christopher has cooperated fully with investigators and has provided crucial intelligence that has helped expose this network's operations across multiple nations. However, his involvement, which began with what he believed were legitimate business dealings, resulted in serious breaches of security protocols and the acceptance of substantial financial payments. The king paused, letting the weight of the admission settle. As of tonight, Prince Christopher has been stripped of all royal titles and military honors. He will face the full consequences of his actions through our legal system, as would any citizen who committed similar offenses. In the BBC newsroom, editors scrambled to update headlines and prepare analysis. The revelation was both more and less than they had expected. More dramatic in its scope, less scandalous in its presentation. Furthermore, Edward continued, this investigation has revealed that several members of the Royal Council and government officials were also compromised. We are implementing immediate reforms to prevent such infiltration in the future, including enhanced security protocols and increased transparency in all royal financial dealings. Queen Isabella felt her heart racing as her husband reached the most difficult part of the speech. They had debated these words for hours, knowing they would either strengthen or destroy the monarchy's future. I take full responsibility for the failures of oversight that allowed this situation to develop. The royal family has always maintained that we serve at the pleasure of the British people, and we have failed to meet the standards you rightfully expect from us. Catherine watched the cameraman's expression, noting the surprise at this unprecedented admission of fault from a reigning monarch. Effective immediately, Princess Catherine will assume expanded responsibilities as heir apparent, including oversight of all royal financial affairs and security protocols. Parliament will be provided with complete access to royal accounts and activities for the purposes of implementing necessary reforms. The announcement continued for another 10 minutes, covering the establishment of an independent oversight committee, new transparency measures, and the royal family's commitment to cooperating with ongoing investigations. When Edward finally stepped away from the podium, the silence in the throne room was deafening. Within minutes, the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls. The first social media reactions ranged from shock to anger, to grudging respect for the king's honesty. Political commentators scrambled to appear on emergency broadcasts, and newspaper editors rewrote front pages that had been set hours earlier. In the private apartments, the royal family gathered to watch the immediate coverage. The BBC's royal correspondent praised the king's transparency, while noting the unprecedented nature of a monarch taking personal responsibility for family scandals. Sky News focused on the international conspiracy angle, bringing in security experts to discuss the broader implications. The phone hasn't stopped ringing, Catherine's private secretary reported. Calls from heads of state, parliament leaders, and at least 50 interview requests. James turned from the television with a grim expression. The opposition leader is calling for an emergency session of parliament. They want a full investigation independent of the royal announcement. We expected that, Isabella replied calmly. Margaret prepared responses to all likely political reactions. A sudden commotion in the hallway interrupted their discussion. David Coleman burst into the room without his usual courtesy knock, his face pale with urgency. Your Majesties, we have a problem. Lord Pemberton just held an impromptu press conference outside his estate. He's claiming the royal announcement is a cover-up, and that he has evidence of financial crimes going back decades. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had hoped the compromised council members would remain quiet, at least initially. What specifically did he claim? Edward asked. Coleman consulted his phone, reading from a live newsfeed. He alleges that several royal charities were used to launder money from foreign sources, that Prince Christopher's activities were known to the family for years, and that tonight's announcement is an attempt to scapegoat lower-level officials while protecting the senior royals. Catherine stood abruptly. Do we have evidence to refute these claims? Some of them, yes, Coleman replied. But Lord Pemberton has 30 years of access to royal financial records. Even if his allegations are false, disproving them will require extensive investigation. Isabella felt a familiar surge of protective anger. Then we investigate. We provide everything, every document, every transaction, every decision. If we're going to survive this, it has to be through complete transparency. The television coverage had shifted to breaking news about Pemberton's allegations. Political experts debated whether the royal announcement had been too little, too late, while constitutional scholars discussed the precedents for removing monarchs who lost public confidence. There's more, Coleman continued reluctantly. Sir Richard Ashworth has been found dead in his study. Apparent suicide. He left a note claiming he couldn't face the shame of prosecution. The weight of the evening's event seemed to crush down on the small group. A man was dead, their family was fractured, and the future of the monarchy hung in the balance. Outside, protesters had begun gathering at the palace gates, their chants audible even through the thick walls. Edward sank into his chair, looking every one of his 68 years. How did we get here, Isabella? How did protecting our family lead to destroying it? Before she could answer, another aide entered with an urgent message. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister is requesting an emergency meeting. Parliament is being recalled for tomorrow morning, and there are rumors of a vote of no confidence in the government for their handling of the security breach. Catherine realized that their crisis had now expanded beyond the royal family to threaten the stability of the entire government. The international conspiracy that had targeted Christopher had succeeded beyond its architect's wildest dreams. It was bringing down not just a prince, but potentially the entire constitutional structure of the United Kingdom. As midnight approached, the royal family faced the reality that their carefully planned announcement had only been the beginning of their ordeal. The real test of the monarchy's survival was just beginning, and the outcome remained far from certain. Parliament convened at dawn in an emergency session unlike any in living memory. The chamber buzzed with tension as members filed in, many still processing the shocking revelations from the previous evening. Outside, protesters had maintained their vigil through the night, their numbers growing as news of Lord Pemberton's allegations and Sir Richard's suicide spread across social media. Prime Minister Sarah Thompson stood before a hostile chamber, her government's survival now tied inexorably to the monarchy's fate. Opposition leader Michael Bradford had already tabled a motion of no confidence, arguing that the security failures represented a fundamental breach of governmental responsibility. The question before this chamber, Bradford declared, his voice carrying across the packed benches, is not merely whether we can trust the royal family, but whether we can trust a system of government that allowed foreign agents to penetrate our most sacred institutions for 18 months without detection. In the royal gallery above the chamber, Princess Catherine watched the proceedings with growing dread. Each speaker seemed to raise new questions about the monarchy's future, and the government's defensive responses only highlighted the severity of the crisis. Back at the palace, King Edward sat in his study surrounded by boxes of financial records dating back 20 years. The independent audit team had arrived at 6 in the morning, and every transaction involving royal charities was being scrutinized. Queen Isabella worked alongside the accountants, her intimate knowledge of palace operations proving invaluable in explaining decades of complex arrangements. Your Majesty, lead auditor Patricia Wells said carefully, we found some transactions that will require further explanation. Several large donations to the Prince Christopher Foundation came from shell companies that appeared to be connected to the same network he was involved with. Edward's heart sank. How much money are we talking about? Approximately £8 million over the past 5 years, Wells replied. The donations were used for legitimate charitable purposes, but the sources appear to be problematic. Isabella looked up from a stack of invoices she was reviewing. Christopher managed that foundation independently. We provided oversight, but the day-to-day operations were his responsibility. That's the problem, Wells explained gently. While the royal family may not have known the sources of these donations, the public will see it as either gross negligence or deliberate blindness to obvious warning signs. The implications were staggering. Not only had Christopher taken personal payments from the criminal network, but he had also allowed them to funnel money through royal charitable institutions, potentially implicating the entire family in money laundering operations. General Harrison arrived with more disturbing news from the intelligence services. Your Majesty, our international partners have begun sharing information about the network's activities. It appears they've been targeting royal families across Europe for over a decade. The Spanish and Swedish monarchies have both been compromised to varying degrees. Are you saying this is bigger than just our situation? Catherine asked via secure phone from Parliament. Much bigger, Harrison confirmed. The network appears to be part of a coordinated effort to destabilize European democratic institutions. By compromising royalty, they undermine public faith and government stability. Edward felt the weight of understanding settle on him. We weren't just victims of a criminal enterprise. We were targets in a geopolitical operation. That's correct, Your Majesty. And our response to this crisis is being watched carefully by both our allies and our enemies. How we handle this could influence similar operations worldwide. The pressure was mounting from every direction. Parliament was debating the government's future. International allies were reassessing their relationships with the UK, and domestic polling showed royal approval ratings in free fall. The protesters outside had been joined by counter-demonstrators supporting the monarchy, creating a tense standoff that required increased police presence. Isabella's phone rang with a call from Christopher, who was being held at a secure facility pending formal charges. She stepped into a private alcove to take the call. Mother, I've been watching the news. His voice was hollow with despair. This is all my fault. Maybe everyone would be better off if I wasn't around to complicate things further. Isabella's blood ran cold. Christopher, listen to me very carefully. You are going to get through this. We are all going to get through this together. Don't you dare consider doing anything to hurt yourself. Sir Richard is dead because of what I started, Christopher continued. How many more people will suffer because of my stupidity? Sir Richard made his own choices, Isabella said firmly, just as you made yours. But this ends now. You cooperate fully with the investigators, you tell the complete truth, and you help us clean up this mess. That's how you honor the people who have been hurt. Meanwhile, in Parliament, Catherine found herself in an unprecedented position. As heir apparent, She was being asked to provide testimony about the royal family's knowledge of Christopher's activities. No heir to the throne had ever testified before Parliament during a crisis of confidence. "Your Royal Highness," Bradford pressed, "are you seriously asking this chamber to believe that no one in the royal household noticed that Prince Christopher was living far beyond his apparent means?" Catherine chose her words carefully. "Members of Parliament, my brother managed his financial affairs independently, as is appropriate for an adult member of the royal family. While we were aware he had business interests, the specific details of those arrangements were not shared with the broader family. But surely someone noticed the expensive cars, the luxury holidays, the high-stakes gambling," another MP interjected. "We were aware that Christopher enjoyed an expensive lifestyle," Catherine admitted. "We assumed it was supported by his legitimate business ventures and inheritance. In hindsight, we should have asked more questions." The honesty of her admission seemed to resonate with some members, but others pressed harder. The session continued for hours, with Catherine fielding increasingly hostile questions about royal oversight and accountability. Back at the palace, the audit team had made another disturbing discovery. "Your Majesty," Wells said, her voice tight with concern, "we've found evidence that the network's infiltration goes back much further than 18 months. Some of these suspicious donations date back 8 years. Edward sat down heavily. 8 years? How is that possible? The network appears to have been patient and methodical, General Harrison explained. They built relationships slowly, gaining trust over time before making any significant requests. Christopher may have been cultivated for years before he even realized what was happening. Isabella joined them, her conversation with Christopher having left her shaken but determined. If this network has been operating for 8 years, there may be other victims we haven't identified yet. Other members of society who were targeted and compromised without realizing it. That's precisely what our international partners are discovering, Harrison confirmed. This appears to be the largest coordinated influence operation in modern European history. As evening approached, the royal family gathered to assess the day's developments. The parliamentary session had ended inconclusively, with a vote of no confidence scheduled for the following day. The audit had revealed the true scope of the financial infiltration, and international intelligence suggested the crisis was part of a much larger geopolitical operation. "Where do we stand?" Edward asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Catherine had returned from Parliament looking drained but determined. The government might fall tomorrow, which could trigger new elections. If that happens, our future depends entirely on whether the new government supports the monarchy or calls for abolition. "The polling?" Isabella asked. 32% support for maintaining the monarchy, Catherine replied. 41% want major reforms. 27% want abolition entirely. The numbers were devastating but not hopeless. Edward realized that their survival would depend on the next 24 hours and the decisions they made in that crucial window. "Then we make our stand tomorrow," he said finally. "Whatever the outcome, we face it with dignity and complete honesty. The monarchy will either survive because we deserve the people's trust, or it will end because we don't. But it won't end because we were cowards." As night fell over the palace, the royal family prepared for what might be their final day as the ruling monarchy of the United Kingdom. 6 months later, King Edward stood in the same throne room where he had delivered the speech that nearly ended the British monarchy. Today, however, the atmosphere was markedly different. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, and the assembled crowd consisted not of crisis managers and worried advisors, but of international dignitaries gathered for a ceremony that would have been unimaginable during those dark October days. The vote of no confidence had failed by just 12 votes, after a dramatic intervention by moderate MPs who argued that destroying the government during an international security crisis would only serve the enemies who had orchestrated the infiltration. The monarchy had survived but barely, and only after unprecedented reforms. Princess Catherine, now bearing the new title of Crown Princess and Deputy Head of State, stepped forward to address the assembly. The constitutional changes implemented over the past months had fundamentally altered the relationship between the Crown and Parliament, with Catherine assuming many executive responsibilities, while Edward retained his ceremonial role. 6 months ago, Catherine began, our nation faced a crisis that tested the very foundations of our democratic institutions. Today, We gather not to celebrate our survival, but to honor those who helped us build something stronger from the ashes of that crisis. In the front row, Queen Isabella watched with quiet pride as her daughter commanded the room with the authority of a true leader. The months of crisis had transformed Catherine from a dutiful heir into a stateswoman of genuine ability. The constitutional monarchy that emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the institution that had nearly collapsed. Christopher sat in a secure facility 200 miles away, serving the first year of a 5-year sentence for financial crimes and security breaches. His cooperation with international investigators had helped dismantle the criminal network across 7 countries, but justice still demanded consequences. He had written to his family just that morning, expressing hope that his testimony at the upcoming international tribunal would help prevent similar operations from succeeding elsewhere. The reforms implemented in the wake of the crisis had been sweeping. All royal finances were now managed by an independent board with parliamentary oversight. The Royal Council had been dissolved and replaced with a transparent advisory committee, including elected representatives. Most significantly, the heir apparent now required parliamentary confirmation and could be removed by a 2/3 majority vote. The network that targeted our institutions, Catherine continued, succeeded in exposing our vulnerabilities, but it failed in its ultimate objective of destroying our democracy. Instead, it forced us to build stronger, more transparent, and more accountable systems of governance. General Harrison, now heading a new international task force on institutional security, watched from the diplomatic section with satisfaction. The intelligence sharing agreements forged during the crisis had led to the arrest of over 60 network operatives worldwide. The geopolitical operation that had seemed so successful in its early stages had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened European democratic institutions. Edward reflected on the personal cost of their survival. His relationship with Christopher remained strained but was slowly healing through regular correspondence and supervised visits. The young man who had nearly destroyed the monarchy was gradually becoming someone his family could respect again. Though trust would take years to rebuild, the public's relationship with the royal family had evolved as well. Polling showed that while support for the institution had recovered to pre-crisis levels, the nature of that support had changed. Citizens now viewed the monarchy as accountable servants rather than distant figures above criticism. The transparency requirements meant that every royal expenditure was scrutinized, every official function justified, and every family member held to the highest standards. Isabella rose from her seat as Catherine called her forward to present the new Charter of Royal Accountability, a document that would govern the monarchy's operations for generations to come. The Queen, who had once worried about protocol and tradition, now embraced the radical transparency that had become their salvation. "Your Majesty," Catherine said formally, "do you commit the royal family to upholding these principles of accountability, transparency, and service to the people of the United Kingdom?" "I do so commit us all," Isabella replied, her voice carrying across the room with quiet dignity. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial to Sir Richard Ashworth and other victims of the international conspiracy. The plaque read simply, "In memory of those whose trust was betrayed, whose service was corrupted, and whose sacrifice reminds us that freedom requires eternal vigilance." As the assembled dignitaries filed out, the royal family remained behind for a private moment. James had returned from a successful diplomatic mission to strengthen European intelligence cooperation. Catherine was preparing for her first state visit as deputy head of state. Edward and Isabella were planning their first public appearance together in months, a visit to the communities that had supported them during the crisis. "Do you think we've learned enough?" Isabella asked her husband as they stood together in the empty throne room. Edward considered the question carefully. "I think we've learned that survival isn't enough. We had to earn the right to continue serving, and we'll have to keep earning it every day for the rest of our lives." "And Christopher?" she asked. "Christopher is learning that redemption is possible but not guaranteed," Edward replied. "He'll have to prove himself worthy of forgiveness, just as we all did." Catherine joined them at the window overlooking the palace gardens, where tourists were once again gathering for the changing of the guard. The normalcy of the scene belied the fundamental changes that had transformed the institution they represented. "The Spanish ambassador asked me an interesting question today," Catherine said. She wanted to know if we considered ourselves lucky or unlucky to have been targeted by the network. What did you tell her? Isabella asked. I told her we were fortunate to have discovered our weaknesses before they destroyed us completely, Catherine replied. The network thought they were orchestrating our downfall, but they actually forced us to become the institution we should have been all along. Edward nodded slowly. The crisis that had nearly ended the monarchy had instead created something unprecedented. A royal family that derived its authority not from birthright or tradition, but from the conscious choice of the people to trust them with leadership. It was a heavy responsibility, but one that felt more honest than the unexamined privilege they had lost. As evening approached and the palace settled into its new rhythms, the royal family reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had lost the comfortable certainties of inherited authority, but gained something more valuable: the knowledge that their service was wanted, needed, and freely given rather than simply endured. The monarchy that survived the crisis bore little resemblance to the institution that had entered it, but it was stronger, more relevant, and more connected to the people it served. In the end, the network's attempt to destroy British democracy had instead forced it to evolve into something more resilient and more worthy of the citizens' trust. Outside, the autumn rain began to fall again, just as it had on that fateful October evening when everything began. But now, instead of symbolizing the storm that threatened to destroy them, it represented the cleansing that had allowed them to build anew. The royal family had learned that true strength came not from avoiding crisis, but from emerging from it with integrity intact and purpose renewed. The British monarchy would endure, not because it had to, but because it had earned the right to continue serving the people who had chosen to trust it with their future.